Thank you for choosing to watch this video. Today I'll be tying a Holy Grail. This is a Caddis emerger pattern. I believe it originates from the States. Someone recommended I should try tying a version of it. For this fly I'm using a fulling mill Czech Nymph hook. You start by mounting your bead, in this case a gold brass bead. It's 2.4mm or 3/32 of an inch. Once you've got the hook mounted in the vise, test the hold and catch the thread on. The thread I'm using for this fly is Semperfli's classic waxed 12-knot in red. For this fly the bead sits back from the eye of the hook. You need to tie in the thorax cover and a hackle in front of the bead. So I want to build up a dam of thread in front of the bead to hold it in place. Now I've seen some tyings where the thread has been looped over the bead and back to hold it in place. I felt that this left the thread exposed to being broken and made for a more fragile tying. So I'm going to try and create the dam independently in front of the bead first, hopefully making for a more robust tying. The bead will slip over quite a depth of thread, so you can taper the dam back to support it and make it stronger. You do want to be careful with building up too much bulk in front of where the bead will sit, because you don't want to crowd the eye too much and make the tie off difficult at the end. So just making sure I've got the dam big enough to hold the bead in place. I think that's about right. Maybe a couple more turns of thread. Or if I use the whip finish to tidy off the dam, that'll save bulk. So that's my dam set up, and I can position the bead so it should sit maybe an eye's width or slightly more behind the eye of the hook. And now I'll catch on my thread behind the bead and start laying an underbody. So I'll create the underbody in a few stages, trim away the waist end, and then I'll run the thread down most of the distance I want for the body, but not quite the full length of the body at first. Doing this in stages will help to build a taper into the body. So I'll take the thread down 3/4 of the length of the body that I finally want and run it back up towards the bead in touching or near touching turns. At this point I'll catch in the rib using a gold wire. This is 0.2mm wire from Semperfli in bright gold. When I catch the wire in, I'll try and slot it inside the bead to take up some of the space in there and help secure the bead a bit more. So catch the wire in down the length of the body. Doesn't have to be in touching turns at this point, as we're going to come back and create a taper later, but as neat as you can is a good idea. So you want to take the body well into the bend of the hook. I think about there should be fine. Then I'll take the thread back up the body, initially in open turns, but as I get up to about halfway up the body I'll more touching turns, because this is where I want to start building a bit more bulk into the fly and introducing the taper. So I take the thread back up to the bead and then start working your way back down the body, again in touching turns. Stop slightly shy of the end of the body and then wind your thread back up. As you say, cycling this by not going as far back down the body each time builds the bulk towards the bead and introduces a nice taper. Just a quick check to make sure I've got all the wire properly covered up, and then I'll take my thread back down and ready to start dubbing the body. You don't need to build too much of a taper with the thread, you can help create it with as you're dubbing the body. So the dubbing for this fly I'm using Fulling Mill's Eco Warrior dub hare's ear for the body. This is a natural dubbing. It creates a really nice buggy effect. Start by catching on a small amount of dubbing, keeping your dubbing noodle quite thin. Make sure we cover up the thread wraps properly. It's worth taking your time and making sure you're happy with the way the body's started. Once you've got your dubbing coat on, you can tighten up the noodle and apply a bit more. I rarely use a wax when I'm dubbing, but I often moisten my fingers. I find it helps it make it a bit easier to apply the dubbing, and this dubbing is quite easy to apply anyway. As you're dubbing the body, it's always worth checking all sides of the fly to make sure you're happy with it, and if you're not happy with any parts of it, go back and redo it. I had some underbody showing through and I wasn't too happy with, so take your time, make sure you're happy with how the fly's progressing and you've got all the underbody covered before you progress any further. Adding more dubbing as you go. I always find it's easier to manage smaller amounts of dubbing on the thread at the same time. It gives me more control over the taper of the fly and the coverage. While rotary vices aren't essential, this is where they can help quite a lot. You can inspect all the sides of the fly quite easily. So we want to take our body almost up to where the bead's sitting, but not quite all the way. We have to catch in a thorax cover, and I want to use a slightly darker dubbing for a portion of the thorax behind the bead. So a little bit more of the body, and that should cover us. Keeping in mind I'll push the bead further forward than it's currently sitting. So fold back any fibres as you lay the last turn of thread in front of the body to make sure none of the fibres are caught in. So I'm now selecting a bunch of natural cock pheasant tail fibres for the thorax cover. You don't want too big a bunch, as this will create too much bulk in front of the bead, but you need enough to cover the top portion of the bead. But first I need to wrap the rib up the body. So as with all the ribbing, nice open turns through the body. Try and keep the turns even spacing and at similar angle. Don't worry too much about trapping any body fibres in, we can brush the body out after. Once the rib's up at the bead, catch it in with a few wraps and helicopter off the waist. This creates a nice clean break of the wire where it's caught in and doesn't leave any sharp points to cut thread or any other materials. So now I'm just making sure the bead's in the position I want it, so I'm pushing it forward onto the dam of thread. It's taking a little bit of force to get it in the position I want, which is good. Means the dam's solid and it should make for hold the bead well. Next I'll catch in my thorax cover on top of the hook, pinch and loop, trying to keep it as tight to the bead as I can. So try and keep it square on top of the hook as you tie it in, and tie it back into the top of the body so then there isn't a gap between body and thorax. Tidy up the tying point and make sure I've got the good solid base behind the bead, and then should be ready to dub the thorax. Again I'm using Full & Mill's Eco Warrior dubbing, but this time in Pepper Box shade, which is a nice darker shade, similar to a dark hare's ear. It works quite well nicely for thoraxes and various flies. just checking that the thorax cover will sit nicely and before I tie off the thread. So I'm going to tie off the thread behind the eye. So I'll apply a bit of varnish to the thread because I want the thread to sit in behind the thorax and not be too visible. So I don't think I'll be able to set a UV resin. So I'll use some standard varnish applied to the thread and then I'll put my usual 3-turn whip finish. This means that the rear portion, body and thorax, is tied off securely behind the bead. Then I'll catch my thread on in front of the bead. A few turns should be enough to hold it in place. Trim away the waste. And then it should be good to catch in the thorax cover. And make sure it's keeping it square on top of the hook. Tie it in with a few wraps of thread, then a locking turn in front of it, and trim off the wastes. We want to be quite efficient with our thread wraps in front of the hook so we don't build up too much bulk and crowd the eye too much. So tidy up the tie-in point a little with a few turns of thread, and then we should be ready to catch in the hackle, which is a Partridge hackle. It's a grey speckled hackle from the neck of the partridge skin. I'm looking for a feather that has a barb length that will reach to the rear of the body of the fly, or maybe just beyond. I guess you can play with the length of the feather to suit your preferences. There aren't many feathers of this size on a skin, and you'll find that you don't have a huge amount of hackle to play with, so you've got to use it quite sparingly. I'll catch the feather in by the tip, and rather than catch the tip in and break away the waste, I'll trim it to length to leave a tie-in point. Catch it in just in front of the bead with a few wraps to tidy up the tie-in point and make sure it's held securely. And using hackle pliers, I'll wind the hackle, folding the barbs back. So typically you're probably lucky to get 2 turns. Take your time and be careful, it can be quite easy to break these hackles, the tips are very fine. Once you've got your hackle wraps on, catch in the waist stalk with a couple of turns of thread. As you can see, the stalk's already getting quite thick, so you've got to be careful not to build up too much bulk. Once you've got it securely tied in, trim off the waist and any stray fibres and tidy up the tie-in point, forming a neat head. So take your time and make sure you've covered up all the waist stalk and your hackle's nice and secure. Once you're happy with that, finish off with a 3-turn whip finish. Doesn't look like that whip finish is holding very well, so I'll put on another one just in case and make sure it's nice and secure. Pull it snug and make sure it's sitting better this time. Yep. Cut away the thread. Now brush out the fly a little, making sure I'm happy with how the hackle's sitting, and pulling out some of the fibres of the body and thorax to give a nice buggy look. That's looking pretty good. So I'll finish off the head of the fly with some Solaris Bone Dry Clear UV resin. You could of course use a standard varnish. You're applying the varnish, or there isn't, just be careful not to get any on the hackle, and cover the head of the fly properly. Happy with the resin application, I'll set it with a UV lamp, and that's the fly finished. Thank you again for choosing to watch this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please drop it a like, and as always, any comments or feedback are always welcome. If there's any flies or patterns you'd like to see me tie, please mention them in the comments.